How should Christians think about assisted suicide? If we put an animal down who's suffering, why not put a human being down? Well, these are some of the questions we're going to talk about today with my guest today, Stephanie Gray Connors, who's written a fantastic new book that I would say, with full endorsement, is one of the best books I read in 2020. It's called Start With What, and it's great because the content, but it's full of fascinating stories and biblical insight. So, Stephanie, thanks so much for coming back on the show for the interview.
Yes, it's nice to be reunited, albeit online.
So let's jump in and talk about your book. What would motivate you as a pro-life speaker? You've spoken a lot on the issue of abortion, to write a book about assisted suicide.
Well, although I'm living in the United States now, I am a Canadian, and in the last maybe 5 or so years, assisted suicide became legal in Canada. Now, of course, in some American states, such as Washington, Oregon, and several others, it has been legal even preceding Canada. Of course, in countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, it's been legal for many years. But when it started to become legal under certain circumstances in my own backyard, I thought this is something that people need education about. That I was finding people might be told, well, as a Christian, I guess I have to be against assisted suicide, but they couldn't really articulate why. And they couldn't give a good reason from a Christian perspective or from a non-Christian perspective if they're speaking to the secular culture. So I thought, well, with my skill set on being able to teach people apologetics on how to defend the preborn child, perhaps I could take that skill set and apply it at the other end of life to teach people how to be winsome and persuasive when it comes to speaking against assisted suicide.
You start the book with a really powerful story of suffering in your own life to kind of, I think, let the audience know this isn't just academic for you, but it's personal. Would you mind sharing that story and just focus on the question that you're aiming to answer in the book?
Sure. Yeah. Well, when I thought about even how to enter into the topic, I really felt that at the heart of the issue on assisted suicide is the question of suffering. And if we have a wrong perspective on suffering, a disordered view of suffering, we're going to come to the wrong conclusion in response to suffering, namely embracing assisted suicide. So we really need to know, in light of suffering that all of us will experience in our lives, albeit in different ways, how ought we respond? And so I decided to go personal and share my own experience of probably one of the greatest sufferings I experienced in the last few years. 5 years ago, I was engaged. Now I'm happily married, but to a different person. So that first engagement never made it to the altar. And before things went south, it was just wonderful. It was the biggest dream of my life. I was 35 years old. I'd been journaling to Jesus for more than a decade about how I wanted a husband. And so it just felt like my life was falling into place. All my dreams were coming true. And in the spring of 2015, our engagement ended. And I was devastated. Like, I have never experienced suffering, emotional suffering, the way I did, to the depths that I did in that experience. And different people have different experiences of suffering, but for me, it was utterly profound, to the point that in that moment, I remember calling my sister and my cousin, and I felt so despairing, so overwhelmed. I felt like my whole future was bleak and dark, that I just said to them on the phone, to my sister and cousin, I don't want to live, I want to die. And of course, my cousin's like, "Where are you?" And so I was in my car, and she's like, "Don't drive, stay where you are." And
Good.
she drove to me, yes, and picked me up. And then my sister also drove to where I was and met us. And but so began a journey of healing, of living through suffering, of questioning God's goodness. God is good, and I know in the moments where I questioned His goodness that I was wrong, not God was wrong. But it really took me on a whole journey to really wrestle with the question of suffering and how we ought to respond. And so then when I started to think about the topic of assisted suicide, I thought, really, what it's all about is suffering that is so profound that it causes some people to say, I no longer want to live. But because suffering is part of the human experience, and all of us have suffered in varying degrees, different ways, and all of us will suffer, then rather than give up on life, we need to help people find meaning and purpose, even in the difficult, even in the challenge. And that's what my own experience taught me, and so many things I learned. And I often say I'm a better woman and a better wife today to my now husband because of the 5 years of suffering and insight and life experience that I then went through because of hardship.
Those of you just joining us, we are here with Stephanie Gray Connors, who's written a new book called Start With What on Assisted Suicide. She's a pro-life speaker and talked about pro-life at the beginning of life. Now she's talking about at the end of life. And it is one of the best books that I read in 2020 and really want to encourage you to pick up Start With What. By the way, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit subscribe. This is brought to you by Biola Apologetics, and we have some other interviews coming up on near-death experiences, on biblical archaeology, and some other topics you will not want to miss. Tell us very quickly about the title, because Start With What is, I don't even want to steal the thunder. I love it, but explain what you're getting at with the title Start With What.
Sure. Well, part of it is to make people go, I don't get it. What does that mean? And because when I started to think about the issue of suffering, what I found is in my own suffering and other people's suffering that I've studied or read about or people have shared with me is we all ask the question, why? Why is this happening to me? Why did this happen? That's a natural question to ask. But the reality is when we try to answer that question, it's not very satisfying. I mean, yes, we can say we live in an imperfect world, that there is sin, that there is evil, that bad things happen. But why one person over another? You know, why are some people victims of human trafficking, but I am not? I can't really answer that other than to say there's evil in the world. So I realized that although we're inclined to ask the question, why is this happening? It doesn't really satisfy us. But when we suffer, if instead we ask ourselves, what can I do in response to this? What amazing, wonderful, incredible thing can I bring out of this terrible, horrible, horrific thing? If we ask that question, that actually empowers us. It gives us hope. It gives us purpose. And it also directs us in the one area we can control, which is what's next, as opposed to what we can't control, which is what happened, our past. We can't undo the past. We can't change things. Whether our suffering was self-inflicted, whether it was other-inflicted, it's done. It occurred. And so why did it happen is a very backward-looking question. What can I do in response to this is a forward-looking question and shows us that no matter how difficult our circumstances, great good can come from terrible suffering and even terrible evil.
So those of you just joining us, we're going to look at some of the toughest objection. I have one coming up for you in a minute here, Stephanie, about assisted suicide. But we're going to take some questions from you as we start working through this interview. So if you want to put them in the comment room, comment board, we'll come back to a number of those. So one of the points you make in the book I thought was fascinating is that society generally decries suicide, but makes exceptions when we put assisted in front of it. Why? What's going on?
Yes, it's very interesting because if we think in the last few years of famous people, there was Robin Williams, Kate Spade, you know, these individuals who tragically gave up on life, committed suicide. And when the news reported on their deaths, there was universal sadness and rejection of suicide. Often every article that cited their suicides at the bottom of them typically had, if you're reading this and experiencing suicidal ideation, feel free to call this line or check out this website. Like it's always, the reaction was to deter people from copycatting what they did, from following what they did. And yet we're in this strange situation in our world today where the same media outlets that will point people in the direction of help if they're inclined to suicide are the same outlets that are often featuring assisted suicide and euthanasia as a positive thing. And it doesn't make sense. And that's one of the points that I want to make in my book is that if suicide is wrong, if homicide is wrong, then blending the two things together that are wrong isn't going to make it right. And assisted suicide is a type of blend of suicide and homicide because on one hand, the person who dies is claiming to want to die, just like someone who commits suicide. But instead of doing it on their own, they're involving another party. They're eliciting help, whether that party is getting them a drug that they swallow or injecting some solution into their arm that kills them. And it's a type of homicide. And so my point is that it doesn't make sense to oppose suicide and support assisted suicide. But it is happening in our culture that I think is obsessively focused on choice and personal bodily autonomy without thinking about the interconnectedness of human beings.
So let's talk about that since you brought it up. Every time I make a post on Instagram or Twitter, TikTok, anywhere in social media about pro-life, the response is always, it's my body, my choice. That seems to be the most common argument we hear, not only for pro-life, but I imagine that would be true when it comes to assisted suicide. So I'm the skeptic and I say, you know what, Stephanie, it's my body, it's my choice. Who are you to stop me from taking my life compassionately if I want to?
So a few responses I would have. If I was talking to someone with any degree of a Christian background, I would make the point that from a Christian perspective, we can't even make the claim, my body, my choice, because our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. And we ought to be stewards of the gift of life that God has given us. And God loves that life. He celebrates that life. He put his image in that life, and he died for that life. He didn't die for any creation except for human beings who he so badly wanted to be reunited with in eternity. And so I would actually question the claim at its foundation, my body, my choice. If I was talking to someone from a secular perspective, I would make also the point that when we make decisions that seem to only affect us, the question we want to ask is, do those decisions only affect us? Or does any choice we make actually have a profound ripple effect on other people's lives, either positive or negative? If I'm present, my presence can impact people. If I'm absent, my absence will impact people. I think of a young woman I actually feature in my book, a woman from Colombia named Zuli, who was born with physical deformity. Half of her arms had never developed, so she has only stubs for arms. And really, she has no legs. And so she experienced great suffering just through her physical difference. Then she endured just terrible suffering in other parts of her life. When she was 2, her father committed suicide. When she was a young child, she was sexually assaulted. She eventually became suicidal in her teenage years and was thinking about ending her life. And thankfully, she didn't. And thankfully, her mom is just her biggest fan, who's taught her to believe no matter what difficulty she faces, she can overcome, she can rise above, she can bring good from it. So now she's a motivational speaker. She's told her story. She is an artist. She does incredible art. And then there's videos of her. So she uses her mouth or her half limbs. And then there's videos of her putting her makeup on with like a makeup brush being held like this. And I'm watching her thinking, wow, what she can do, I could never do. But my point is, several years after the hardship, when she started being really open about her story and having a more positive outlook on life, a local TV station featured an interview with her that they aired on TV. And that story was aired at the exact moment there was a young man who was really despairing in his life because of difficulty he'd gone through. And he was planning on killing himself. He was so close. He had obtained a gun. He was going to end his life, but he had the TV on. And the TV that the station he tuned into was interviewing Zuli. And so he was captivated by this young woman, her story, her suffering, her overcoming of all that she faced. And suddenly he felt that he could carry on. And so instead of picking up the gun and shooting himself, he picked up a pen and paper and he wrote her a letter, and they have since become friends. Now, I often use that story in response to the question you raised in order to demonstrate that no man is an island. Had Zuli killed herself back when she was a teenager and suicidal, then her story years later of overcoming hardship never would have been aired on TV at a pivotal moment when someone else was despairing, who then would have ended his life had he never heard her story. So he was impacted by her presence and decided to keep living. But had she been absent from the world because of suicide or assisted suicide, then he also would have been impacted by her absence and very likely followed through on his inclination for suicide. So the reality is, when someone ends their life, whether by themselves or with the assistance of another, it does not just impact them. It impacts the people around them who are left behind, for example, to put the pieces together. I think of, there's another story I tell in my book of a police officer who's basically considered the guardian of the Golden Gate. And his job is to patrol the Golden Gate Bridge because there are so many suicide attempts on that bridge. And his job, when discovering someone is about to try to jump off the bridge, is to go and try to encourage them to have hope, to get off the bridge and to get help.
Sure.
And he cites a story of a young man. There are 200 people alive today because he successfully talked them off that bridge and into getting help. So, it's beautiful what he's done, but there have been a handful of cases where very sadly, he, would spend an hour, several hours in the rain on the edge of the bridge talking to someone, and then they suddenly just jump. And so he tells this story in his book of a young man who ultimately jumped, and how he eventually connected with that young man's parents. And one of his observations was that man's death didn't just affect him, it affected his whole family that was left behind to work through and live with the impact in the wake of the choice that he'd made. So the idea that if I end my life, it doesn't impact you is proven false. And those are just two of many examples I could have given.
In sum, the idea to capture what you're saying essentially is that we are not just an island. We have responsibilities, moral responsibilities to one another. So in a sense, it's not just my body. What I do with my body affects my neighbors and my families and others. So there's a moral obligation that is there. Did I capture that?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely, yes. And in fact, there's a great quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that I use in my book. He said it or wrote it in his letter from Birmingham jail. And in that letter, he says, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, and we are tied to a single garment of destiny." And then he says, "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And so even I think about once we legalize assisted suicide, we create a climate where there may be some, for example, old people who request assisted suicide, not because deep down they truly want it, but because their neighbor requested it a year ago and had it. And they think, my neighbor isn't a burden on her family. And I feel like I'm a burden on my family. And I guess it's legal now. And since she asked for it, maybe I can ask for it too. Maybe if she's not a strain on others, then I won't be a strain on others. And so someone might even claim it's what they want, but they were impacted by the choice of another, by the influence of another, by the example of another.
So what if the family comes together and says, hey, we agree this is best, you're suffering, we're all in agreement here that it's the most compassionate thing to do is for you to end your life? Does that change the equation? Because it seems the dynamic and obligation there, at least to family, would change.
Good question. I would say that even when people seem united on a position, if the position is inherently wrong, then it's not ethical. It's like if you have, a 2-year-old child that has Down syndrome, and all of the family around the child, the parents, the aunts and uncles think, yeah, life's going to be hard if you have Down syndrome, especially because so many people with Down syndrome have been aborted. They won't even know other people like them. We all agree as a family, we want to end this child's life. And I think we would have this consensus of, whoa, that wouldn't be appropriate, even if there's agreement, because might isn't what makes right. It's not the consensus or the majority. It's the nature of the action itself. And so instead, I think we need to ask, if we would support a family member ending their life through assisted suicide because they're suffering, what degree of suffering is enough for us to support that? Because all of our relatives suffer, some more than others, at certain times more than other times. But where do we draw the line? One of the points I make in my book is that there's a woman in Canada, I read a news article about her, that she wants assisted suicide because she has fibromyalgia. I have a friend who lives with fibromyalgia. Many people know someone with fibromyalgia, and a lot of people would say that's not serious enough a condition to justify ending your life. You're certainly not even near death. Yes, you live a life perhaps with chronic pain and exhaustion and all kinds of negative impacts, but you couldn't argue, okay, well, you're 6 months away from death. So the question is, if we allow suffering as our justification for supporting a loved one in ending their life, then we would always have to support someone who wants to end their life, because people will always suffer. So how do we decide the degree of suffering that justifies the ending of someone's life?
One of the things you do in your book is you ask questions, you make distinctions in terms of like what you just said. If we allow suffering in one case, then where do we draw the line? How much suffering? How much time? I can imagine the pushback would be, well, that's just a slippery slope fallacy. Why can't we just say, if you have 6 months left to live and it's terminal, then we'll just draw the line right there, because we got to draw it somewhere. Just because we don't know exactly where we should draw it, let's draw a line and stick with it there. Why are you not persuaded by that move?
Sure, for several reasons. First, it is entirely arbitrary, and although the person suggesting 6 months might be satisfied with that, there are many people who would be dissatisfied and
Yeah.
say, that's unfair. I have a year and I don't want to live for another year. And that's, if we reference my home country again, that's what we're seeing in Canada, where assisted suicide was legalized the last few years under very limited circumstances. And already there's an effort right now in the government to expand the law so that more access to assisted suicide can occur. So I think the idea that we just pick a line, if we're going to pick anywhere, then the general attitude is when lives are involved and when there's a risk that we could do harm as well as good. The general attitude always is, let's err on the side of caution. Well, then if we err on the side of caution, I think a proper standard would be we allow nature to take its course. People die. The person who is against assisted suicide is not against death. We recognize that tragically, because of sin entering the world, death entered the world. Death is a part of life, although it wasn't God's original design. So I realize that one day I'm going to die, but there's a difference between dying naturally and being killed purposefully. So I think the line should simply be, when death comes knocking, we might not be able to hold our body against the door forever. Eventually,
Okay.
that door is going to be pushed open. But we ourselves should not open the door and invite death in and inflict the intentional ending of someone else's life on them or on ourselves.
That's a similar distinction I've heard made when it comes to if there's spontaneous abortions or miscarriages, would that justify abortion? And the distinction you're making is there's a natural death that's unfortunate, and the intentional taking of a human life changes everything. And it sounds like it's the same principle that's here.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you this.
Mhm.
One of the things we hear is that assisted suicide is death with dignity. Why do you take issue with that phrase and don't actually believe it's a reflection of dignity?
Good question. So I would ask the person who makes that claim, what do you mean by that? And what is a dignified death? And if someone, for example, has cancer and instead of choosing assisted suicide, they die naturally, but they're very emaciated and they, vomit a lot and they constantly need medical and other supports around them to aid them with all they're going through. Are you implying that such an individual doesn't have dignity, or they have lost their dignity, or that when they die naturally, that is not dignified? And on what basis are you making that claim? Another point I would make in response is I can recall, and I reference this in my book, a story I read in the news. I believe it was France. It was some European country where a apartment was entered in the last few years that had been locked for decades. And some people believe that it had been unentered for about 70 years, so since the war. And then there was some evidence of later newspapers, but still decades we're talking about this apartment was untouched. And when the owner of the apartment eventually died, the people that were being bequeathed it, I guess, got access to the apartment. And inside, it was like stepping into a museum. I mean, besides the fact that there were cobwebs everywhere and dust on everything, this woman had been very wealthy. And there was this one piece of artwork by a famous artist that when the people went into the apartment, found it, they realized it was worth, I think it was over €1 million.
Wow.
And it was ultimately auctioned off. But the painting, upon discovery, didn't look very good because it was covered in dust and it was covered in cobwebs. And so I often use that in order to ask people the question, did the painting lose its worth? Did it lose its value? A, because no one knew about it, and B, because it was covered in dust? No, because it sold in an auction for over €1 million. Instead, the realities of time and it being unknown and untouched caused dirt to come upon it and dust to be on it. But because it had value, that caused people to respond by treating it accordingly, wiping away the dust, restoring it, making it ready for auction. And so the same is true when someone is sick, when they're disabled, when they're dying. There are things that go on that are unpleasant, profound pain, perhaps tumors that take over your face. As I mentioned, maybe you're soiling yourself, maybe you're vomiting, all kinds of things, but it's not that we lose our dignity in those moments. It's that those things might seem to be like the dust on the painting. They seem to cover up a bit our dignity. And so the way we show that we actually have dignity is not to throw our lives out, but to change the person who can't change themselves, to wipe the drool off the person who cannot wipe themselves, to give comfort and surround the individual with beauty. And when we respond that way, we're showing, oh, you have dignity because of who you are, not because of what you can do or no longer do, not because of what you did look like or no longer look like. Your dignity is inherent to your being, and I will respond by reverencing you, which reinforces you have dignity, as opposed to just ending your life, which implies dignity is something you can lose.
In some ways, at the heart of this debate is the question of dignity. Is it something you have because of what you do, or something inherent? And Mark Regnerus, a sociologist in Texas, he wrote an article maybe 3 or 4 years ago, if I remember, called Dignity 2.0. And he said dignity, according to our founders, the Universal Human Rights Declaration, classical Western philosophy, is something inherent you have. Like if you're the number 2, you're inherently an integer. You're inherently even. Humans have dignity because of what they are. But it's shifted now that we gain or lose dignity based upon our choices or based upon how people treat us. So it's something that can be gained or lost. So it seems like at the heart of what you're saying is that human beings have inherent dignity. So like a painting that was lost and dusted has to be cleared off, didn't lose its internal value. So because it has value, we should treat it accordingly. And that's the same with human beings. They might lose ability, they might suffer, but there's dignity that is there. Thus, we should treat them accordingly. That seems to change everything. If you view human beings as having inherent dignity, that's kind of at the heart of this, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because if I think of, different campaigns to, amongst teenagers, help them with their self-esteem, help young girls, see their value, it's all oriented to a message that aligns with what you just said, where we tell young girls, your value isn't in how popular you are. It isn't in your looks. It isn't in how much makeup is caked on your face. Your value is in who you are. But we seem to lose that message when it comes to the end of life. So what we're trying to proclaim to teenagers about an inherent dignity is something that we're claiming can be lost, that it isn't really in you when it comes to someone who is sick and suffering. And so that's why I think it is so important that we be proclaimers of a message of an inherent dignity. And that means proclaiming the gospel. And that's one of the things I wrestled with, and I talk about in my preface. Do I write a book that is totally non-sectarian, where I just make, arguments against assisted suicide almost from a human rights perspective, human equality perspective, or do I incorporate the gospel message? And I think you can go so far with a non-religious message, but I really believe the fullness of the message against assisted suicide really involves a gospel-centered message, because if there is a God who loved me so much that he willed me into existence, and then when I separated myself from him, he, like a lover, came running back to me and gave his life so that I would have a chance at eternal life, because that's how valuable I am, because I bear his image, because he loves me, then that's the message, if all that's true, that we need to proclaim and help people understand, so then they realize their dignity can't be lost.
Let me ask you kind of a practical question here. This always comes up, and I'm gonna put it up on the screen here. And Ricardo Sierra says, "What about someone who's in a coma, or perhaps is no longer conscious for some years, and you are told to pull the cord? Would that be considered assisted suicide?"
So good question. So one of the things that I cover just briefly in one of my chapters is some of the nitty-gritty when determining whether we begin a certain intervention or treatment, or whether it's ethical to cease an intervention or treatment that already has been occurring. And one of the things I explain is that as we try to wrestle with that and determine, for example, if someone's in a coma, and we're still providing nourishment to them because they can't feed themselves, they can't hydrate themselves, we're turning them over because they can't turn themselves, and so forth. How do we determine whether we should continue that or not? And an ethical principle that's generally been used over the years, decades, centuries, is one where ethicists will talk about that which is proportionate versus disproportionate. Maybe more classically, it's been referred to as that which is ordinary and that which is extraordinary. And so I would say that we have a duty or responsibility to pursue that which is ordinary or proportionate, which means
Okay.
it's not excessively burdensome and there's a hope of benefit. But we don't have a moral duty to pursue that which is extraordinary or disproportionate, which would be excessively burdensome with no hope of benefit. So that's the general theory. Now let's look at it in a case where you've got someone who's non-responsive. If what we're doing is providing nutrition and hydration, which their body is capable of processing, it can break down the nutrients and so forth. It's not harming them by giving them hydration. It's not causing fluid to fill in their lungs and make them feel like they're drowning, but instead it's actually preventing them from feel like they're dehydrated. I mean, that's a terrible feeling when you're really thirsty or when you're really hungry, right? So if it administering that which we need, which is not excessively burdensome to give to the body, and of course has the hope of benefit, the body is able to process it, then we should pursue that. So if someone's in a coma, but we are giving them that basic care, then I would say that we have a responsibility to pursue that care. And an example would be someone like Terry Schiavo, who I mentioned in my book. She was a young woman who was married, and it's unclear exactly what prompted, but she basically passed out one day, and because of a denial of oxygen for a certain period of time, it resulted in some brain damage. And so she was being cared for in some type of assisted living place. And as time went on, she wasn't dying, and there was some medical interventions that were happening, some physiotherapy, but then her husband said that she wouldn't want to live like this, so he wanted to cease all treatment. And the parents and the brother said, well, we'll take over care for her. We want to pursue this. She's been showing some signs of progress in her physical therapy classes and so forth. And so there became a massive legal battle between the husband and the parents and brother. And ultimately, the husband won in court and was able to ensure everything be ceased, including nutrition and hydration. And she wasn't near death, where nutrition and hydration could perhaps be difficult for her body to take. And so she basically died by starvation and by dehydration. And it was a very brutal and painful death. So she wasn't communicative in a way you and I are, although the parents and brother would say that there had been indicators that she was comprehending things. But as time went on, those lessened, although there were still some signs, because she wasn't given the adequate care that they would say that she needed. But the point is, in that case, the stopping of that which was ordinary or proportionate was immoral and ultimately led to her intentional killing.
I remember the Terry Schiavo story, and it was chilling because it seemed that she was still there and she was present, and decisions were being made for personal gain of the husband rather than what is truly best for Terry. That's really where the debate was. And
yeah, he had moved on. He had gotten married, and at least if he had gotten married, he was in a relationship with another woman. And so that's partly like the brother and parents were like, okay, if you really want that, fine, but why are you stopping us from taking over control of her care?
One of the first things you say in the book is that assisted suicide should never take place. Let me see if I can find exactly how you worded it here. Oh gosh, how do you say we should never do it says you say that suicide should never be assisted. That's the way you phrase it. No exceptions at all.
Well, no exceptions, because I don't believe there are exceptions for basically ending the life of an innocent human being. And I don't think it's our prerogative to end another person's life, which is what assisted suicide involves. I also don't think it's our prerogative to end our own life, that we've been given commands to love our neighbor, to love God. Part of loving God is loving God's creation, which includes ourselves. It's seeing God's goodness in us, his image in us. But certainly part of loving our neighbor is to therefore respect the life that they've been given from God and not take their gift of life from them. And so assisted suicide involves doing that. And I know it's interesting, like we live in a culture where people have a hard time with extremes. We have a difficult time with that, which is black and white. And a lot of people want to be in the gray zone and say, well, aren't there certain exceptions? But we have to ask ourselves, if there is one exception for assisted suicide, why not two? Whatever basis or rationale we provide for this one particular exception is probably a type of rationale that would also apply to other exceptions. And so there's really one of three positions. You can have suicide assistance for no one, you can have suicide assistance for some, and you can have suicide assistance for all. Well, most people are horrified at the third option. But then they kind of go to this middle zone where they say, okay, well, it would be wrong to give suicide assistance to everyone, but if someone wants to jump off a bridge, I think I should try to stop them. So, but what if someone's close to death and they're really uncomfortable and they just don't see any point in continuing to live? Maybe I would therefore support suicide assistance in some cases. But then if you ask the person, well, why in the case of the elderly individual who sees no meaning in continuing to live, what would be your reasoning for supporting suicide assistance then? And they might say, well, that's what the person wants. It's about choice. But then I would bring up the person that whose suicide they didn't want to assist, was just someone about to jump off a bridge. And I would say, well, the person who's about to jump off a bridge, aren't they saying that's what they want? Aren't they saying they no longer want to live, they see no purpose in continuing their life, and they would like to act on that by jumping off the bridge? You're going to try to stop them there. If it's truly about choice, you have a duty to help them. If it's not about choice, if it's actually about you making a judgment that that person who's going to jump off the bridge is a life worth saving, then in the other case, perhaps you didn't realize it's what you were doing, but you were making a judgment that elderly person's life isn't worth saving. So it's not really about choice, it's about judgment. But then who are we to make a judgment that that isn't a life worth saving, but over here that is a life worth saving? So if we really believe in human equality, I think the most logical position is either suicide assistance for all or suicide prevention for all. The middle zone is the most illogical, and therefore I go to the suicide prevention for all.
So I want to clarify, tell me if I'm getting this right, is that people typically resist suicide. If the person wants it, if they're emotionally suffering, we should stop it. When it comes to assisted suicide, we qualify it for different reasons. You're saying there's no qualitative difference between the two, and any criteria we give to say you shouldn't commit suicide is going to bring some kind of contradiction and inconsistency when we talk about assisted suicide. So I guess I'm bringing it together in my mind. We tend to think about these as like different issues, and you're saying actually they're exactly the same issues. The particulars change, but the principles are the same for both of them. Is that fair?
It's totally fair. And that's why I love being on your show, because you summarize things so well. So yes, I couldn't have said it better.
Okay, well, good. I'm trying to get my own mind. Here's a great question that jumped up, and I'd be curious how you would address this one. Joe Jersey says, how is a dying soldier on the battlefield asking for that last dose of morphine? Wouldn't that be an exception?
So great question, Joe. And what I would say is it is or isn't, depending on why the morphine is being administered. If he is in so much pain that the morphine as a painkiller is going to stop his pain, then it would actually be ethical to kill a person's pain by administering a painkiller. It's the very nature of what painkillers are for. But if his pain level, let's say, has been addressed, but he's just like, I'm dying, when the pain comes back, instead of another dose, like just up the dose, give me more than I need in order to tip me over to end my life. Then at that point, the administration of the morphine isn't to kill his pain, it is to kill his body. And so that's what we want to discern anytime someone is sick in the hospital, whether they're on a battlefield or whether they're in a hospital or getting home care, is we want to ask, why am I administering this medication, this treatment, whatever I'm doing? Why am I doing it? And if it is in response to some type of pathology, some type of illness in the body, and it is designed to aid that person in their suffering, then it's ethical to do. But if we're administering such a high dose with the intention of eliminating the person, then that is where we will have crossed the line.
So it's back to the intentions, really. And I think you talk about this in your book, that if there's some medication, morphine, whatever, that helps eliminate the suffering, but the side effect is that it could speed up death. In some circumstances, that would be justified because of the intention of the act that's being done.
Correct. That you're not only intending to kill the pain and not the person, but the very action of administering the painkiller is in direct response to pain that is present. Now, when I used that example, I added a sentence in there after one of my friends who reviewed it as a physician, and she made the point to me that that example is often used. If we need to give painkiller to stop pain that might shorten someone's life, it's not unethical because we're killing pain. She made the point that although that is trying to demonstrate the principle, that in many cases administering painkiller doesn't actually shorten a person's life. So she's like, in practice, it actually typically doesn't do that. But in order to convey the principle, the point is, what action am I committing? And what is my intention? And if the action is I'm giving painkiller in the presence of pain, and my intention is to kill the pain and not the person, then action, intention, check, check, I'm good. But if I am administering more painkiller than necessary to address that pain, and I'm actually wanting to end the person's life, well, then clearly on one or both of those levels, I'm doing something wrong. That's why even in hospitals, I've not been in this situation, but some loved ones have. After different surgeries they've had, they themselves are the administrators of the painkiller. And so they're laying in bed, and if the pain is really bad, there's a button that they get to press. And there eventually comes a point where the pressing of the button no longer gives you painkiller, because the doctors and nurses know there's a certain point where it would be harmful to take that much. So they want to give you a degree of control that when you really feel pain, you press it, but not give you so much control that you would actually make an unwise decision in your pain just by and then, knocking yourself out.
By the way, Stephanie, you're doing great. I want people listening to appreciate how hard this is. One of my colleagues who Scott Ray at Talbot, who's written a huge book on ethics. He's literally one of the leading Christian ethicists in the world, and he's actually my co-host for the podcast that I do. He has said this is arguably the hardest ethical issue to deal with theologically, scientifically, and philosophically, because there's a lot of unknowns. So I appreciate you being willing to just talk about this and take some of the tough questions. Here's a little bit of a personal one, and I'm gonna give this to you because I know you can handle it. But this is from someone named Doug. He's an atheist, is not a Christian, and he says, "My sister died 8 months ago on a feeding tube. She had MS, extreme pain every day. The family wished her to die soon. She was a Christian and suffered greatly for years because of her Christianity." Now, I don't know what that means because of her Christianity. We don't have to unpack some of that. But I'm curious what your comments would be to someone who's not a believer, who had a sister die extreme pain, and it seems the family did want her to pass away soon.
Yeah, that's very hard. I mean, my first response is to just express my condolences, not only for the loss of your sister, but the profound suffering, not only for her, but for all of you, because it is not easy to see and witness and be with a loved one when they're suffering, because we so badly want to alleviate their suffering. I remember after my dad had surgery, he had a very serious complication, and the doctors didn't know initially what it was. He was rushed to another hospital, and I was in the emergency room beside his bed. And I remember wanting to scream at all the nurses because they were handling other patients. And I wanted to be like, "Don't you see my dad is suffering? Like, what are you going to do right now to fix it?" So I can relate to that just deep desire within to want to instantly correct a loved one's suffering. That desire is good. And the wish that that she would die soon was perhaps more an expression of a wish that her suffering would go away, which is really what I think when we say, "I want to die," or "I want my loved one to die." It's not that so much as that we want the suffering to stop. What I ask people to consider, as hard as it is to be suffering or to witness another person suffering, are there certain standards we have, certain lines where we say, "I may not cross this line no matter how difficult it gets"? To give an analogy, and it's very different from the circumstance this man's sister found herself in, But I think, for example, if you have someone who has a great goal of finding a cure for cancer, but to do that, they have to become a scientist. To do that, they have to go to university. In order to get into university, they decide to bribe the university. Well, I think we could all agree that that goal, while laudable, does not justify bribing the university. I mean, we have cases in
Sure.
the news right now where this happened in the last couple of years. And so in the same way, where that's like a golden standard, I may not cross the line and bribe the university. The kind of gold standard is I may not cross the line and commit suicide or commit homicide. But we need to do everything in our power to alleviate someone's suffering. I don't know the specifics of her case and can't
Sure.
speak to the specifics, but having friends who are palliative care physicians, I do know that, for example, palliative care physicians are specialists in pain control in a way not all physicians are. So the first thing we want to ask is, are we getting the right care for someone who is in excruciating pain? The second thing we want to ask ourselves is, if I eliminate the person whose pain I can't yet correct, what motivation do I or society have to try to come up with better pain meds or to try to come up with cures? I think, for example, of before we had insulin for diabetics, diabetics would die very early. If we just killed someone with diabetes because we didn't have insulin, what motivation would we have had to come up
That's
with
interesting.
insulin? It was only because there was this unsolved problem that we were seeking a solution. But when we kill someone, we've kind of come up with a solution. So therefore, we don't feel the same degree of crisis to come up with a real solution or a better solution. I think another point perhaps I'd make, and again, I'm just obviously speaking generally,
Of course.
but
Yeah.
even with this woman and her profound suffering that I can't claim to know how terrible it was, it sounds like she held to her Christian faith. So I would perhaps encourage the listener who is an atheist to explore in the silence of his heart and really think about, if she could go through that brutal suffering and still believe God existed and that God was good, what is it that she knew or she felt or she believed that I could at least give some time and attention to? And that's often, and I've used stories in my book, that's what has really touched me as I've studied people who suffered. There were times when I went through my broken engagement where I would say wrongly, but I got angry at God. I blamed God. I shouldn't have. Marriage isn't a right. It's not like, well, you do this and you get that. But I felt so much pain. I felt, why is God allowing this? And why isn't he listening to my prayers? And one of the things that moved me was the witness of people who experienced suffering that I would say was much worse than my suffering. And they not only didn't get angry at God, they would thank God and they would love God. And I think of two examples in my book. One is Michael Morton, who's got an incredible story. He was living in Texas, and he had a 4-year-old son and a wife, and or maybe even younger than 4. But anyways, his wife was brutally murdered. Brutally. He wasn't at home, and he was unfairly framed for the murder, and he spent 25 years of his life in prison. And thankfully, thanks to an amazing organization called the Innocence Project and new DNA testing technology, they were able to find out who the real killer was, identify him as innocent, and then he was released from prison. If you read his book and the brutality he experienced in prison, on top of the fact that his wife had been murdered, on top of the fact that his son was taken from him and he wasn't able to raise him, you just read his story and you're like, this is so unfair. This suffering is so profound. And yet in his book, he talks about loving God and God loving him and God being good. And so I remember it was the example of someone like him that made me think, if he can endure profound suffering and still say God is good, then there's something there for me to wrestle with. There's something there for me to learn from. So I would say, as hard as all you've been through has been watching your sister suffer, there was something in her, in all of that, that was still able to say God is good. And where is she now? I would say, in eternal happiness, where there is no more tears and there is no more suffering, and celebrating the goodness of God.
One of the comments said, I love this woman, Stephanie. How kind is she? Wow, great guest. So just want to give you some encouragement for a very compassionate and thoughtful response. I put you on the spot there, but I knew you could handle it, and you knocked it out of the park. So thanks for a great response. Let me ask you a few more here. One of the most common ones is, well, when animals are suffering, we put them to death out of compassion. So why don't we do that with human beings?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So the first thing I often want to say to people who bring that up is fair point. Like, on the surface, that's a really good rebuttal to someone who holds my view, because people would say, "Oh my gosh, we are treating animals better than our loved ones by putting them out of their misery." Would be the quote. Why aren't I putting my loved one out of their misery? So my responses are as follows. The first is kind of my short response is to say, simply because the difference is humans aren't like your pet dog. If they were, then when grandma comes for a visit, we put a leash around her neck and we tie her to a certain wall in the house. Or, when it's dinner time, we tell grandma to go on her hands and knees and eat out of a bowl on the floor. We don't do those things because she's different than our pet dog. And so that's kind of on the surface level, the first response that I would make. But going a little deeper, I would ask someone who makes that claim to think for a moment about a question that seems off topic, and that is, why is slavery wrong? What is it about slavery that we who believe in human rights object to? And of course, what it is that it involves treating humans as objects rather than subjects. We view our peers based on their usefulness to us, what they can do or not do, and what we can get from them. And we also view that individual as disposable, so that when they're no longer producing what we want, like an object would, we can get rid of them, or we can trade them in for something better. And we reject that perspective. Instead, we say, wait a minute, humans are subjects, not objects. We should be valued for who we are, not what we do, not how we make others feel. So that identification of what makes us different from objects tells us that we therefore need to treat each other differently than how we treat objects. So we cannot view the human person as disposable, nor can we view their value based on their function. So when a dog can no longer, walk or do other things, you can't do what you once did, so we'll get rid of you. But the value of a human isn't in our function or accomplishment, it's in our nature. What is our nature? Well, as image bearers, our nature is that of God, and God is a communion of persons who's always in a relationship of love, of giving and receiving love. No matter what suffering we face, no matter what circumstance we're in, we're always capable of love, whether we're giving love or whether we're receiving love. But we cannot fulfill that nature of love without life. If we are not alive, we cannot love. And so when we treat the human like the family pet, and we end that human's life the way we end the life of the family pet, we're eliminating the very life that is necessary to be in a relationship of love.
There's a formula in the book that I think gets to the heart of what you're getting at. Again, those of you just watching, I really hope you'll pick up the book Start With What, that is really hot off the press. And it's a formula from Viktor Frankl, and it's D equals S minus M. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. Explain what that is and why it's so significant.
Yeah, so I love Viktor Frankl, now deceased, but he was a Holocaust survivor and a psychiatrist who wrote an incredible book called Man's Search for Meaning. And one of the things that he talks a lot about is what I talk a lot about, which is suffering. And suffering for him was not theoretical. It was not something he read in a textbook. He lived it in the concentration camps. He observed it in his fellow prisoners. And he also saw it in the lives of his patients as a psychiatrist. And so what he observed time and time again when people were in terrible circumstances of suffering was the last of the human freedoms, to paraphrase him, that can never be taken from us is the freedom to choose how we respond to the situation that we're in. So we can be treated like animals in a concentration camp, but we can still choose to respond in such a way as to not behave like an animal. And so he then came up with this little mathematical equation, which you mentioned, D equals S minus M. And what he observed in his observations of the human experience was that when someone was in a situation of suffering, the S in D equals S minus M, what they were really doing was living out the human experience. All of us will suffer. But whether they despair, go to the D in light of suffering, was entirely dependent on the M. Can they find meaning? And so what he found was when people could find meaning, not only in their suffering, but inherently tied to the experience of suffering, then the number for despair would go down. But if when suffering, someone found no meaning, then despair would go up. And he, in an interview, gives this great example of a teenager from Texas who had been in a car accident, became quadriplegic, and of course she couldn't move her arms and legs. And so he said, let me tell you how she spent her days. She would watch the news, read the news, and whenever she came across a story of someone suffering, going through a hardship or a difficulty, she would call for an assistant to come to her and place like a stick in her mouth. And then she used the stick to pound out letters on a keyboard in order to write notes of encouragement to people that she'd read about in the news. and Dr. Frankel was like, this young woman lives a life of profound meaning and purpose. It's not that she's not suffering. She is suffering, but she's not despairing, because she found meaning not only in her suffering, but tied to her suffering, her experience of her loss of function, her reliance on other people, enabled her to uniquely empathize with the people she read about in the news. And therefore, if she could motivate them, then, and they could learn of her story, then they could find a will to keep living. And so it's that philosophy which is really at the heart of that title again. Start with what? What am I going to do in response to this evil? What am I going to do in response to this suffering? What good can I bring out of this terrible thing? It doesn't make the terrible thing good. I wouldn't suggest someone go around intentionally get in a car accident to try to become a quadriplegic to do what that woman does. Obviously, that would be disordered, because we ought to preserve the body and keep the body as healthy as possible. But where that is out of our control, where accidents happen, where age happens, where sickness happens, we can say that's not good, but I can bring good out of this. And the question for each of us is, what is that good? And that puts us on a journey. It's going to be different for each person, but it's an opportunity and it's hope. And in a world filled with despair, we are in a desperate need for hope.
We definitely are. That thinking when I first read the part of your book was like, wow, instead of asking the why question, as an apologist with training in philosophy, I ask it. I teach a class in our apologetics program at Talbot. Why does God allow evil? And we talk about this. And obviously you see the value in that philosophical reflection. We need it. But practically for somebody, rather than focusing on the why, the question that changes everything is, what can I do with this? And that story, I took that example and cited you in the next book I'm working on way down the road, of that teenage girl who's like, these circumstances are terrible and painful, but I'm going to ask what I can do and encourage people, is so humbling to me. When I look at my life, I'm like, oh my goodness, that person is great in the kingdom of God and a hero, even though most people never know her name. Let me ask you one last question. We'll wrap up because I want to respect your time. You share a story in this that just was moving. And what I love about the book is it's just full of stories about Verna and Martin, who becomes unlocked. Explain what happened in the principle that you draw from this.
Sure. Yeah. So that story blew my mind when I read it. So it's a book written by a man by the name of Martin Pistorius. It's called Ghost Boy. And it's the story of his life. He's from South Africa. And when he was around 10 years old, he got sick, and it appeared to be the flu. But he never got better, and he continued to decline, so that within a year, he was non-communicative. So he would no longer speak. And he started to get like spastic, and his limbs would be curled in. And he basically, is what is now labeled as he became locked in. He was a mind trapped in a body. The doctors told his parents that he had the mind of a 6-month-old child, that he had regressed that much. And so he was in a type of daycare. He'd come home at night, but because his parents worked, he was put into a center where he was cared for. And if they went on holiday, he was sent to another center where he was cared for. And so after a couple years of this, he suddenly became aware. It's like he woke up, but his body didn't change. And so Martin did not have the mind of a 6-month-old child. He was aware of everything going on around him, but he still couldn't move properly to convey anything he needed to, and he couldn't speak. And so what he writes about in his book is what his life was like. And there was just brutal suffering. Like some of his caregivers would give him a shower. It would be cold water. I mean, can you imagine if you were being cleaned by someone, the water was cold, but he couldn't tell them it was cold. They thought he didn't know. There was one place he went to where I actually had to stop reading the book at that point. I was so horrified that the brutal sexual abuse that was inflicted upon him. And again, his mind was fully aware and he could not speak. He could not cry out. And then along comes Verna. So this went on for about 10 years. And Verna was a massage therapist. And so her job was to go around to the patients, beautiful, sweet smelling oils, and massage into the patient's limbs. And one day she was massaging Martin and he's just like looking spaced out, but she looks at him and she goes, "You're aware in there, Martin, aren't you? You understand me, don't you?" Well, he couldn't say a thing. He couldn't change anything. He couldn't say, yes, I am. He's just as spaced out. But she had a sense. There was a sensitivity to her spirit to be able to receive what was going on in his spirit. And then she happened to see a documentary about progress being made. I think it was on dementia patients and how to try to reach them when they seem caught in their mind. So she goes to his parents one day and she says, "I think your son is aware inside." And they're like, "Well, the doctor said he's a 6-month-old baby." And she's like, I really think he's aware. Like, I think you need to take him for further testing. So because she advocated, the parents took him for further testing. And basically he became unlocked. And it started very simply with literally, it was like one finger moving things on a computer where the trained technician was able to get certain messages out of him, to the point that today, he has not only become unlocked, but he's regained the use of his upper body. He's able to drive a car. He's given a TED Talk. He wrote the book, Ghost Boy. He got married, and he and his wife thought they would never have children, and they naturally conceived a couple years ago. And he now lives in Great Britain. I mean, his story is amazing, but what I take from it is that we're all supposed to treat other human beings like Verna treated Martin. That even if she had been wrong, that he was aware inside, she treated him with reverence. She treated him with gentleness. She treated him with kindness. That's what we do with babies. None of us remember when we were 3-month-old. But it's a good thing our parents were kind to us, even though we don't remember it. And if Martin had never become unlocked, it was still a good and right and noble thing for Verna to treat him with reverence. But all the more when we became aware of the fact that he was aware and he was suffering profoundly, and it was her belief in the unlocked potential that caused her to advocate for him, that we never know when we treat others with reverence and we advocate on their behalf, what is possible. And the last point I'll say about a story as it relates to the earlier remark about God from the person who mentioned being an atheist, is Martin also writes very beautifully about sensing the presence of God. And he wasn't really that churched. I mean, he is Christian, but growing up, they didn't do a lot of church. But he writes so beautifully in his book that he sensed the only person who knew he was there and believed in him was God. And he even talks about how I didn't need proof for God's existence the way God didn't need proof for my existence. Wow. No one else believed I was there, but God did. And God was with me, and God comforted me. So again, I think if someone like Martin, who suffered the way he did, can believe in God and praise God, then so can I.
That is just an unbelievable story. I just feel my eyes kind of tearing up thinking about what he went through for 10 years. Aware of this is just heartbreaking. And it took one person, even though, like what you said, they didn't know, right? That's what makes this issue so hard, is there's some unknown. Can the person heal? Can the person recover? We don't know these things. And assisted suicide says, well, let's err on taking life. Your position says life gets the benefit of the doubt because there's dignity, and we treat people with dignity. And I appreciate that you said it doesn't always result positively this way, but many times it does. There's a lot of people that just said, powerful, love the story, keep sharing it. This, just for those of you watching, I want to respect your time. We went a little bit over, but this story and pretty much every other story you shared, I think, is in the book. And we've really just probably gotten through 20%. There it is. Hold it up so you can see it. Start with what?
Yeah, except it has this is the author like preprint version. So your version won't have this gray line, but here it is. Yeah.
That is fantastic. I want people to see that, because you start with stories, you draw the principle about it. And the way Jesus did, you just tell stories that are memorable and powerful. It's easy to read. It's so interesting. It's, like I said, it's one of my favorite books I read in 2020, and I was honored to endorse it. So those of you watching, if you enjoy this, I hope you'll consider picking up a copy, do a review for Stephanie, do it online, share it, maybe share this interview if you enjoyed it. Just one of the reasons I do this interview is just to help people get the word out who I think are doing great work. And Stephanie, you're doing that. So we really appreciate you coming on. As those of you know, this channel is brought to you by Biola Apologetics, where I teach full time. And if you've ever thought about getting a master's degree, a certificate program, there is information below. We have it was this semester, Stephanie, that we actually have gone fully distance program. And so we are pumped to be able to train even more people. There's info below. We'd love to have you join us. And make sure you hit subscribe and notifications, because next week we actually have an archaeologist who will be streaming in from Jordan, who studied at Hebrew University, talking about some recent archaeological discoveries. Have a medical doctor coming on soon to talk about near-death experiences. We've got a really cool lineup that you're not going to miss. So make sure that you hit subscribe and join us. Again, wonderful job, Stephanie. Appreciate it. Hang on for just a minute, but we're going to wrap up. Thanks again for being with us today.